G'day, welcome to the Financial Bloke Podcast, the podcast for people seeking the wisdom needed to grow their family's wealth and live a happier, healthier and more prosperous life. My name's Ben Law and I am the Financial Bloke. Welcome back to the Financial Bloke's Wealth and Wisdom Podcast. My name's Ben Law and I'm your host. It's been 12 months since we did the first instalment of the Cattleman series at the 3R Beef Annual Stud Sale, which is held on the historic Goonoo Goonoo Station in Tamworth, New South Wales. The episode was a live recording at the pre-bull sale dinner. It's an interview with 3 high-calibre guests, which I did as a panel-type format again. The interview was tailored to the audience who were all driven, successful commercial beef producers who are excited about the future. This year's theme was Reimagining the Future of the Beef Industry. Now, Jeff Birchnell is one of the directors of 3R Beef, and I've known him since we were kids. He's a passionate producer and supporter of the beef industry. And if you want to know more about Jeff or 3R, his interview was episode number 7. Now, the guests are David Foote, the president of Cattle Australia, Paul Harker, the Chief Commercial Officer at Woolworths, and Kari Moffat, the Sustainability Manager of AA Investment Group and a member of the Australian Beef Sustainability Framework Steering Group. Now, I know I'm probably biased, but I think it was a cracker event again this year. So strap yourself in and let's reimagine the future of the beef industry. I just want to thank Tony and Jeff and all the 3R team for putting this event on. It's very rare you see something like this, and I know a lot of effort's gone into it for everyone in the team. Tonight, Jeff and I talked about doing this topic tonight, and we sort of threw a lot of things around, and we came up essentially with reimagining the future of the beef industry. And there's a whole lot of change going on, not only in the world, but in the beef industry itself. So we figured if we could reimagine the future and try and prepare ourselves for it. And when we talked about this probably 4 or 5 months ago, I said to Jeff, this sort of reminds me of Charles Darwin's quote, which is, it's not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent that survives. It's the one that's the most adaptable to change. And I think that's really relevant for us here tonight. And I think I wrote down also that as the world evolves, so must our perspectives and also our practices. And that's what we're hoping to get a little bit out of our guests tonight, which I think will be fantastic. Now, I'm going to give you a little bit of a rundown on each of their resumes, which, again, same as last year, is I'll only be scratching the surface. So I'll kick it off to start with. As Jeff said, we have Mr. Paul Harker here, who's the Chief Commercial Officer at Woolworths Supermarkets and Metro, I think is the official title, isn't it? Bit of a mouthful. So Paul's got nearly 30 years of retail experience spanning store operations, supply chain, buying and marketing. Through his professional background, Paul has an extensive understanding of retail, including strategy, operations, logistics, technology and consumer marketing. And this is also coupled with an extensive knowledge of the fresh food supply and value chain. As I said, he's the Chief Commercial Officer at Woolworths, and he's also the Non-Executive Director and Deputy Chair of Hort Innovation, which is the Research and Development Corp for the horticultural industry. So thanks for coming along, Paul. Next, we have Mr. David Foote, who you probably all know as the Chairman of Cattle Australia, which is the peak body for beef graziers. David and his wife, Marion, have a cattle property in the Mount Kilcoy district, but he's got an extensive resume, which, as I said before, I'll only just scratch the surface on. I went through your LinkedIn and it was like, holy dooly, how am I going to summarise this down to 30 seconds? But for the past 45 years, David's held a rural property management, executive and senior management positions across Australia. He was in a leadership role at Australian Country Choice Group of Companies since 1999 and is now the chair of the advisory board. He represents the ag industry in roles such as the non-government member of the Australian-Indonesian Red Meat and Cattle Partnership, Deputy Chair of Laguna Bay Pastoral Investment Committee, and the Chair of Angel Seafoods, just to name a few. More importantly for us tonight, he's here as the Chairman of Cattle Australia, which, as you know, is a national peak body representing the grass-fed cattle industry. And last but not least, we have the lovely Kari Moffat, who, as Jeff again said, is the Sustainability Manager for AAM Investment Group. Kari grew up on a beef property in regional Victoria. We won't hold that against her tonight. She's got 9 years experience in the livestock export sector with a focus on animal welfare, compliance and sustainability. Kari is actively involved in the industry through the Australian Beef Sustainability Framework Steering Group and an executive of the Queensland Livestock Exporters Association. She also is a founder and previous chair of the Young Livestock Exporters Network, and she holds a bachelor degree in business and agriculture from Marcus Oldham College. And currently she's the sustainability manager of AAM Investment Group, which is based in Darwin. So she tells me tonight she forgot a jumper, which is a rookie error for someone from Darwin. And AAM is an investment fund which has over or almost $900 million invested in beef cattle, lamb, wool, sheep, cropping, poultry and the timber industries. So if everyone could just put our hands together for the panel guests, which as you can tell is an absolute wide variety of experience, which I'm really excited about tonight. So now we're going to kick off the first question, which is going to be a really short, sharp couple of minutes from each person on the table. Now, Jeff and I talked about this and said that the beef industry as a whole is dealing with substantial change, and with substantial change comes problems, but also substantial opportunity. So our specific question we each want a bit of a comment on is, why do you think the Australian beef industry is uniquely positioned to thrive in the future? And what I mean by that is not only maintaining market share, but also growing it. I'll hand over to David at the end first. Hopefully he's prepared.
Thanks, Ben, and welcome everybody. And it's quite an irony to get somebody who's the resident dinosaur in the room to be here about reimagining the future. So it's very, very kind of you. I mean, our unique position is something that's taken a generation to build on. And if you think about our market access, not just in overseas markets, but also in outlets like Paul's, is that it's been built on the trust that we can provide a consistent, safe and ethically produced product. Clean and Green worked overseas. It's had its time. It is not a unique proposition for us to say we're clean and green. It's a platform for us to build on from this point. And we have to continue to meet the consumer's needs. It doesn't matter how good we think we are if people don't buy it. But our history is we've shown unbelievable resilience. We've adapted through fire, floods, famines, GST, global meltdowns and COVID. And we're still here. And we're still ready to line up and continue to buy cattle to keep operating our farms. So our position is we build on from our solid base and foundation, but we just have to be adaptive to what the consumer needs are, not just here, but globally.
Well, I think it comes down to two things, similar to David, people and product. So the industry is comprised of a broad range of very skilled, professional and innovative farmers, and also supply chain professionals that make sure that the industry in Australia is world leading. It is adaptive and is innovative. And when I say product, I mean quality. So we have a high quality product in this market, and a lot of people that get out of bed each and every day to make sure that that high quality product is available, not just here domestically.
I think we have a real advantage to take advantage of this trend that we're seeing in demonstrating sustainability credentials. We're already seeing this trend flowing into our trade negotiations with our international markets, but the opportunity lies in the fact that we already know we're strong in this space. The recent ABARES report that was released that looked at sustainability credentials of our agricultural commodities, both here in Australia and our international competitors, showed that we stack up as some of the most sustainable agricultural producers around the world. We produce some of the most lowest emissions intense beef around the globe. And I think that's a real opportunity and something as producers we need to be really proud of. And the opportunity to align practices, capture data through our supply chains and be communicating this to our markets gives us the opportunity not only to be maintaining our market access, but continue to grow that into the future and really lead the conversation in how beef sustainability is measured and communicated to our consumers.
Fantastic. Thanks, everyone. And from my point of view, I think, as Kari, just to reinforce what you said, is we're some of the best beef producers in the world, and we just need to be selling that story and that narrative to our trade partners and to the consumer to be able to get that across. So we get control of the narrative, don't we? Now, Paul, you get first cab off the rank now. So what I wrote is the world's changing, the distance from paddock to plate is shrinking. So in other words, where consumers are more and more concerned about what's happening on farm. Animal welfare, sustainability, carbon emissions are in the vernacular these days. People are talking about it, whether we agree with it or not. Now, I reckon Woolworths must have some pretty unique insights into, consumer trends and what the future consumer might look like. I reckon they're probably driving their business to know that. So my specific question for you, Paul, is what does the consumer walking into Woolworths look like, let's say 10 to 15 years from now? And what does the Australian beef industry have to be doing to gain a greater share of the weekly grocery spend for the consumer?
Thanks, Ben. Look, red meat continues to be a core staple of Australian families, and it remains a core part of their shopping basket. But obviously, cheaper proteins over time have started to sort of erode into some of the space of red meat. So not surprisingly, poultry being the cheapest protein available happens to be the largest now and makes up a large proportion of people's diets. So we do know that value is very important to customers, and particularly when they're under economic stress. So various times of the year or economic cycles that'll obviously come and go in terms of how people are trying to manage their budget. But we do know when we look at younger consumers now that if you think of value as being a representation of what people are prepared to pay for what they're receiving, their expectations of what they're receiving is lifting. So we know that younger consumers today are wanting to understand more about what's happened in the supply chain of the food that they're eating. We know that they have a greater curiosity or desire to know how animals are being treated in the supply chain and how farming practices are being conducted, and they're obviously very concerned about the environment and what they perceive to be significant impacts on the environment. So that's sort of what young people are talking to us about today, and what they're increasingly asking of us when we put products on the shelf. The other thing, when you look at younger generations coming through, is they look for convenience. So convenience is a big factor. And if you look at convenience segments in our stores, they'd be some of our fastest growing parts of our store. So they're looking for us to get portion size just right, to minimise food waste, to cater for smaller households. They're looking for things that are very easy for them to do. Some people don't like touching meat, so they look for pre-prepared stuff that can literally go straight into the oven or the pan without them necessarily having to do anything to it. And they're looking for value-added flavours and the like, rather than doing things from scratch. So you've got this sort of mix going on of people, between scratch cooking versus looking for those shortcuts for their meal occasions. We also know that families are increasingly time poor, and that is another thing that drives sort of convenience. And you can sort of go through the repertoire of sort of family staples they can pull together very easily. It's probably no surprise when it comes to red meat is that mince would be the biggest category for two reasons. Probably one, price point, but two, it's so versatile and can turn into so many family meals. So I think, from a red meat or a beef perspective, being able to tell those stories, it helps with that value conversation with customers. So it's about price, but it's what also you deliver in the products, and how you can talk to the great work that is happening already and will continue to happen around stewardship of farms and livestock. And also how we think about those products being presented on the shelf for smaller households and people looking for convenience. Isn't that interesting that people's lives are getting busier and they're wanting simple solutions, isn't it? And it's interesting. I always look at this and say, well, what does the consumer want and what is the consumer willing to pay for? Because I know I want a lot of things, but I don't necessarily always get what I want. So that's what I always find fascinating, Paul. So thanks for that. It's interesting. David, producers are busy people, as I'm sure you know, and a lot of what we see out in the marketplace and, we're talking about especially tonight, may seem sort of outside of our control or possibly even irrelevant to producers. And I accept that, within the marketplace, there is some noise. There's just market noise that we can just ignore.
But I also reckon that there's a certain amount of things that we may not agree with, but we just have to accept and move forward on, especially if we want to maintain access to premium markets and also achieve a premium price for our product. So my specific question for you tonight is from your perspective as the chairman of Cattle Australia, what actually should producers be aware of, and why the hell should they even care?
That question's a bit more deep and meaningful than was sent to me, Ben. But we're going to try and scratch our way through it. But before I do, I just want to reiterate what Paul says. And if I look across the 60 or 70 or 80 people here, trust me, you're really good, decent people, but you are not typical of the people that you are trying to feed or provide food for. Your habits, particularly your dietary habits, are in no way, shape or form resemble those that you are trying to serve, either across Australia or more particularly globally. The average Japanese will sit down and eat 27 grams of beef at a sitting. Grams, not kilos, grams. We sit down and we feel robbed if we don't get a 300-gram slab of red meat on a plate with chips and salad as a minimum. So we've got to understand the consumer that we're actually trying to serve and be aware of that. And that comes back to the market access. It is a segue to the question in part. But there's some things out there that we need to be aware of, that the EU in particular, you've all heard that we're trying to do a free trade deal with the EU. The EU has historically, since the Second World War, been the most restrictive access market on the planet. And if you think for 1 minute they're going to change, no matter whether it's Don Farrell or Dan Tehan that's trying to get the deal, you actually have to think again. Currently, the EU Deforestation Act that was passed back in June by the EU Parliament, it will preclude no matter whatever we gain in the FTA. Now, it's not so bad for the blokes in Victoria and Tassie and New South Wales and their wives, because you knocked all your trees down prior to 2019. But in those parts of Australia where you either have cleared your land from virgin to turn it into food producing, or in fact you have land that has regenerative timber on it, such as brigalow, that will need knocking down again every 7 or 8 years, that beef will no longer be accepted into the EU. The Deforestation Act now prescribes that as a beef exporter, not only does your health certificate provide the lifestyle of that animal to that point, it now has to include the geolocation over the lifetime of that animal that is in the box of meat. If that animal has come from land that has either been deforested since I think it's December 2020 and or revegetated and or cleared, that beef will not be allowed access into that market. That's the bang for the buck for the beef farmer. And of course at the moment is the allocation to that country is minuscule. I mean, this room will eat more tonight than they're allowing us in on a daily basis for a whole country. So that's the market access piece. So it's out of our control, Ben, what we do to gain for that if we wish to conduct our business, which is not unfair in those people that have cleared their land under legislation, allowable legislation, those that have actually gone through clearing or gone through vegetation management under lawfulness of Australia will be precluded from places like the EU. So without wanting to be on my sermon or soapbox tonight, it is a market access constraint which could be described as the strongest non-tariff trade barrier ever invented against the Australian beef farmer, and we should be making noise about it wherever you can, that it's unfair. UK, on the other hand, clearly with the market access gain there under FTA, 110,000 tonne. I mean, historically, we've only had 3,000 tonne access. So 110,000 tonne with no tariff in the future is an unbelievable undertaking, an opportunity for our beef business. But coming back to almost your question, not really, I've nearly finished the speech, but anyway, I better get the answers out, is there is considerable government noise over the environment. And a bit like the live sheep export, it's based on emotion, not science. We really have to combat decisions that are made that affect our industries and our livelihoods that are solely based on emotion and potentially against the science, such as the ban on live sheep export, as I say. So we just got to be really careful. But to do that, we have to have platforms that show we are doing what we say, not just saying what we can do. We're going to have to change. And we're in a sector of industry that change isn't something we do easily. If we go back and think about the major programs that has put across our industry to gain market access, not only internationally but domestically, old enough to think about going back to tail tags, old enough to think about NVDs, old enough to think about NLIS. None of us chose those programs voluntarily. We fought like cat and dog against why. Why would anybody want to impose on us? We now celebrate them. We have market access because of them against our competitors. So we don't do change well. So we just have to manage the systems that are being asked to be included in our daily management programs and our cattle management programs to be adaptive and reflective of the future.
Today's episode is brought to you by AgriCoach. You've worked bloody hard over the years and you've built a solid operation. But as your children grow up and start their own journeys, you're beginning to think about the next 5, 10, and even 15 years and how to keep driving the business forward and ensure a smooth and successful succession plan. Preparing the business, preparing the next generation, and preparing for your eventual retirement all requires a solid plan and a proven process. Unsure about the right steps to take? Head on over to agricoach.com.au/webinar to learn more about our Succession Proof Your Family webinar. AgriCoach, aligning families, growing wealth, and protecting legacies. And now, let's get back to the episode. And it's interesting. What the point you make there is that a lot of these things are outside of our control, so we have to adapt to what's required. But also, I think we have to have strong industry leaders and good data to be able to go back and push back against the politicians that are suggesting these sorts of things should just be accepted without any pushback. I think that's really important. Next, we've got Kari. So again, Jeff stole a little bit of my thunder here, but I wrote 5 years ago. Probably no one would have heard of sustainability management, let alone there would have been an absolutely job title like sustainability manager. So now you work for one of Australia's largest and most successful ag investment companies, and if they've created a role for you and for all the other people out there doing that job, there must be a bloody good reason why. So I'd like to ask you, why are you there and what does this sort of role entail for the industry?
I think, Ben, probably why it wasn't in our common language before it, because it's just good business. Sustainability is good business. And if we define what sustainable agriculture is, it's the ability to meet our food and fibre needs now without compromising the ability to meet our future generations' needs, which is pretty important if we think about the fact that our kids need food and fibre into the future. As you mentioned, I work for AAM, and it's part of our business that we want to create a sustainable legacy. And what I mean by that is that it's part of our strategic approach that we want to ensure that we leave our assets in a better way than when we purchase them. And that could be through infrastructure developments or creating efficiencies in the way that we're operating our production systems. Year in, year out, we want those assets to be generating food and fibre. And it wouldn't be a very good investment if we were degrading those land assets over that period in which we're managing them. We want to look after our land, but we also want to look after our people and the rural communities in which we operate. We're very proud to employ over 550 people across Australia, with 75% of those living in rural communities, which is something we're very proud of. But what I'm talking about isn't anything very new. It's, as I said, it's just good business. But where my role fits into that is that we operate across 4 states and territories across Australia, across a number of different sectors and assets. So my role is about capturing that information and data about how we do what we do on the ground, compiling that information, baselining it and capturing that year on year to demonstrate continuous improvement, identify gaps for opportunities for us to continue to invest in those assets and communicate that to our stakeholders. And obviously as an investment organisation, one of our biggest important stakeholders is our investors, who I think as agricultural producers, we take for granted that not everyone understands how we do what we do. So having that data and information to communicate to our investors across sustainability indicators gives them comfort in that we're operating those assets in a sustainable way. And I think it's a pretty exciting opportunity for someone young like myself to be a part of that. I've only been in the role a few months, but it's very exciting, and I'm loving it so far.
Thanks, Kari. It's interesting. We were having a conversation this morning, weren't we? Just running through the questions and making sure everyone felt comfortable. And Kari was sort of discussing, what a sustainability manager does, because I had some questions around that. I didn't really know what it meant. And essentially I said, well, you work for a corporation and they're all about sustainable management. But everyone here in this room that owns land or cattle or employs people is essentially a sustainability manager, because we all want to leave the land, the community, our animals, our business better off than we received it, don't we? And so I think that's no different to what every other producer is doing out there in the marketplace. So that's a great summary. Thanks, Kari. Now, Paul, back to yourself. This is an interesting question, so I've got a little bit of a story to start with. But, today everyone's environmentally conscious, animal welfare conscious, so it's very much in the vernacular. And consumers are seeking, that, as you mentioned before, greater transparency. And things like sustainability, carbon footprint, animal welfare and environmental impact are becoming critical concerns for the consumers. Whether they're willing to pay for it, we need to see. And they're wanting to make informed choices about the products they purchase. And we all know that this comes at a cost for producers to be able to do this. So my question to you is, do you see that if the beef industry meets or exceeds these expectations, they can expect to get a premium price for the product? Or do you just think in the future, for across the export market, the domestic market, that it's just going to be what's required as a minimum to access the market?
Always the perennial question, who's going to pay? It's a great question. We know that red meat is in the top 4 areas of concern for our consumers when it comes to sustainability. So you're right in the sense that it becomes a topic of conversation with our customers on 2 fronts. One is animal stewardship, and the other is obviously on land stewardship and the impact on the environment. And increasingly, consumers are having the expectation that people will do the right thing, that Woolworths will do the right thing in terms of what it presents to them, and the people who are involved in supply chains will be doing the right thing when it comes to that. In the short, medium term, when you're differentiating your product on shelf based on those attributes because you're a fast follower or you're leading, then there is an opportunity to tell your story versus the table stakes of the more generic industry standard product on the shelf. But as industry standards change and what was, niche becomes the norm, then normal market forces will come into play. And that is to say, supply and demand, particularly when it comes to agriculture, will ultimately determine prices that people are getting paid, how much is available versus how much demand there is for it, which is why I think when I think about the Australian market, and David spoke about it before, with 75% of our beef being exported, the domestic prices here will be subject to how successful we are at retaining those markets overseas. Otherwise, you have stuff that's normally exported being reserved to the domestic market, which increases supply on the domestic market, and obviously prices drop when there's excess supply, and unfortunately get to a point sometimes where it drops, and no matter how much it drops by, you can't eat anymore or sell anymore. So look, I do think in the short term there is some advantage. I think those people who get in there and help us tell their stories to explain on the shelf, so you've got product tiering and therefore pricing hierarchy, there'll be a return. But I think the long term is as it becomes the norm, there'll be less of that opportunity, and how well Australia does or doesn't do on the global stage in terms of exports will have the biggest bearing on what happens here domestically with price.
Well, isn't that interesting? It pretty much tells us that whatever happens overseas, we are an island, but when it comes to trading and selling our goods, we're not an island. We're very much influenced by what's going overseas, which, David, I think you sort of intimated there earlier on. And I could see Kari furiously writing an answer down there. This is going to tie perfectly into Kari's question at the end. So watch this space on the concerns that consumers have. So, Kari, you're also heavily invested in a number of industry committees. Just like everyone else, you've got a busy lifestyle. And one of the most relevant to everyone here in the night is you're a member of the steering group committee for the Australian Beef Sustainability Framework, which is a hell of a mouthful, and hopefully everyone's heard of it. So for anyone that hasn't, can you give us a quick rundown on what the Australian Beef Sustainability Framework actually is? And in your mind, why organisations like the ABSF are so important to the beef industry, and more importantly to producers like everyone in the room today that are at the coalface of production?
This was the question I was most excited to talk about, because I think the Australian Beef Sustainability Framework is probably one of our best kept secrets, because it's a tool for the Australian beef industry to demonstrate our sustainability credentials. It's how we produce beef here in Australia. The ABSF talks about how we produce beef alongside sustainability indicators like the environment, our animal welfare, our people and the communities, and our economic impact that we have in Australia. It gives a really clear snapshot utilising data to demonstrate to our external stakeholders through that information how we're operating. I don't know about everyone in the room, but over the last couple of years, I've felt like the beef industry is under attack. And I think if you listen to the mainstream media, you would think that the world's problems are the result of the beef industry. And as a very passionate cattle enthusiast, that's something I'm pretty passionate about defending. And I pretty much see the framework as our sword and shield. And what I mean by that is it gives the ability for when we're on the offensive, such as our trade negotiations with our international markets, to demonstrate our animal welfare credentials or how we manage our environment. It also plays into accessing green-linked loans with our banks. We've seen NAB and Commonwealth utilising the framework for producers who want to access those lower interest rates to demonstrate through the framework how they're producing beef sustainably. So there's that real commercial aspect to it. However, on the flip side, it acts as our shield. And what I mean by that is it's our defense mechanism. When we're hearing these narratives in the media that are talking about how they believe beef is produced, and I mentioned earlier that I think we take for granted that people don't know how we do what we do. It's using scientific data to counteract that narrative. And David talked on that earlier. And I only used it the other day. So I was sitting in my university lecture, and for half an hour, I listened to the lecturer talk about how bad the beef industry was, how we didn't care about our environment, we didn't care about being sustainable, and went as far as saying, it'd probably be best if we cease to exist. And I got pretty angry. It was a recording, so I couldn't voice my opinion at the time. Probably lucky. So I had to think about it. How did it get to the point where this lecturer had picked up this information and was teaching it to a room full of students? He'd probably Googled environment and beef and grabbed the first article that came off the website. And it was an article out of the US. It had absolutely nothing to do with the production systems that we have here in Australia, but that's what he was teaching this class. So I grabbed the framework and was able to counteract the information that he had given the class with the factual information of how we produce beef here, and gave him the link that if he wanted to find more information, this is where he could find it. And it was in that moment that I realised how important this document is to verifying how we do what we do. And even if it's only a defence mechanism, it plays a really strong role in demonstrating transparently our credentials in being a sustainable industry.
Thanks, Kari. I knew you'd enjoy that. Did a great job, didn't she? And look, I just want to say I interviewed Mark Davey last year. He's is he the chairman? Yeah, the chairman of the ABSF. And we had a conversation about this, and he said, Ben, essentially what we're trying to do is gather enough data to be able to counter the narrative. So get facts and figures rather than just the evil old narrative that's so easy to be spread. And I think that we need to find those data points and arm everyone in the industry with that information to be able to go out and counter it. Because it's not just going to be industry leaders that shout this from the rooftops. It's going to have to be a grassroots thing where every producer's armed with, as Kari said, their shield and sword. And as you wrote down there, Kari, that Paul mentioned, was it one of the top 4 concerns of customers of Woolworths is about the beef industry. And so is that correct? Did I get that right?
Protein.
Yep. Yeah, protein. Yeah. So I think this is just a great way for us to be able to counter that narrative and go out and sell that beautiful story that we've actually got. So thanks, Kari. That was a great story, especially about the uni lecturer. You would have enjoyed that. Okay, and finally, David. Now, we're in an era of rapid technological advancement. We've got constant innovation and increasing government regulation, and the rate of change has we've basically reached levels that we've never witnessed before in history. And we talked about that last year. And it's a stark reminder that the momentum of progress will only continue to accelerate and leave no room for the industry to be complacent. And if we want to thrive as producers and as an industry, we need to really embrace that adaptability. And I think that'll be the secret, and capitalise on these opportunities as they come available. So from your vantage point, David, and as I said, there's the chairman of Cattle Australia, why should producers be really optimistic about the future of the beef industry?
First up, just to talk further about Kari's comment, in a recent survey of industry, the whilst farmers are the 3rd most trusted and reliable source of information in the community, teachers were voted the 1st. So the influence of the person that Kari spoke of is having a louder voice than we have as a group. So we have to reflect on that and do it. Secondly, there's 270,000 new mouths born today across the planet. Hopefully someone will eat beef. And sadly, there's 870 million people who did not have enough nutrition today to survive on this planet. So there should be demand if they can afford it and if we can produce it. But if you want to talk about technology, then it's all here for us. If you think about the ag tech that's available to you now, you may not like all of it, but who hasn't got a mobile phone? That's technology. We didn't have it 20 years ago. We had party lines. But if you think about it back in your own farm operations, the technology that's available to you. If you think about technology that can do feed efficiency to make your cattle produce more on less. You think about what Kari spoke about, sustainability, which is also about doing no harm but producing the same. And then just topping off and the segue into why we're here today, if you think about genetics, that you can select genetics that achieve the feed efficiencies, improve your sustainability. The Livestock Improvement Company in New Zealand now offer the carbon footprint of the bulls they sell you via semen. They give their lifetime. We're not there yet, but the technology is there. But the ultra measure of all this, if you don't measure it, you can't manage it. And there's a million pieces of technology out there to help you do that across your farm, across your landscape, across your animals.
And it's interesting, I did a podcast recently with Dr. Terry McCosker, who just did one of the first large-scale carbon farming trials up in central Queensland, and I think they were issued, I think it was $6 million worth of carbon credits off these 2 properties. And the thing that came out of that, the beef industry, so producing beef, was actually a positive for the environment when done sustainably and in the right ways, which I think the vast majority of producers are doing. So there's an absolutely brilliant narrative to be talking to the community. So now we've got a few minutes for questions. Jeff, have you got the microphone over there, mate? I'm sure everyone will be ready for a question.
Yeah, I just got a question for Kari with regards to the university lecturer. Did you get any response? Because obviously you've replied with some pretty factual stuff, but did you get any response? And if you didn't, did you follow up?
Not the response I wanted. Yeah, I got thanks. So it really cut it off. But yeah, I did go back and provide all the counter arguments to the information that they'd provided. It just really demonstrated how important it is for us to get our information out there, because if we don't, someone else will fill the void, and it'll be based on science that doesn't necessarily put our industry in a good light. It only tells one part of the story, or it's based on a production system overseas that isn't equivalent to how we do it here. So it just really demonstrated how important that framework is to our industry.
And I think also data, just being able to capture the right data to be able to tell the story factually, so the science is there. Excellent. Who else have we got?
Thanks, everyone. Really interesting talk. Ben, you mentioned the word narrative, but to the three panel members, how do we control the narrative as producers?
Well, there's one way of ending up with a united voice that represents your industry and or your sector. Is a really good way to start, because it helps shape the real and what's there every day. And that's also part of Kari's statement is you may not or may be aware of it. There's a little booklet that's been around for nearly 2 years called Red Meat, Green Facts, and it's now been updated to Red Meat, Good Health on the back cover. And it would be a really useful booklet for all of you to have had once, but more importantly, to give it to somebody who's not in your industry. Give it to your doctor or your service station or your fish and chip shop owner, if there is such a thing anymore, fish and chip shops, because it's not only about convincing us, it's about convincing the others who don't understand, as you call it, the narrative, but it's just selling the message. But unity of purpose and unity of voice will always be to come up with a common language is the best way we can do it, working together, not trying to individualise our commentary.
Just to add to David's point, I was having this conversation recently around the importance of our national farming organisations. It was around sustainability and setting goals. And if you look at other big emitters, like let's say airlines or car companies, there's 10 major players and they have the ability to get in a room and set a direction because they have the majority share. Whereas in the beef industry, we have thousands of us, and it is very difficult for us to get that alignment as individual businesses and individual people. That is where our national farming organisations like Cattle Australia are so important, to be aligning us as a collective group and setting that strategic direction so that we have a way forward. We're demonstrating the path we're on, and we have the data and that unified direction to be able to take to government and take to external stakeholders to demonstrate what path we're on.
So it's a very hard thing to market a lie. So you actually want to deal in facts to, I'm not suggesting that there's a lie in this, but if other people are putting about misinformation, having the correct information to counter it and doing it as an industry is super important. So I concur with both your points. In which case I would ask how much of research and development and things like that is actually being put into this as an industry, or is it more of the immediate needs as opposed to the existential threat of pseudoscience, misinformation, demonisation that can go on in the absence of proper information? So I'd say make sure you have all the information that you possibly can, because if you've got the right information, it's far easier to market, and you've got lots of bodies that can help do that. Consumers don't have a lot of time. They're bombarded with lots of information and decisions on a daily basis that they need to make based on that information. So being able to cut through that very quickly and have the credibility behind the claims that are being made will help them make their decisions in your favour each and every time. So get the information, have the facts, come together around those facts, and then help us at shelf tell that message by having the authority and the credibility behind the claims that are being made. I think the challenge without that information, it just becomes bigger, because as governments start pushing tier 3 emissions into other organisations, everyone else is being measured on everybody else. So without having the information, there'll be pressure that will come from other angles other than just the customer as regulation change pressure comes. So you really need the correct information to make sure that you're starting from a level playing field. And I don't think with some changes you could make a reasonable difference to the baseline that already exists. I reckon if you had the baseline 10 years ago, it'd show what tremendous inroads have been made in that space of time. The problem is without having the baseline, you start again from scratch. So getting that as soon as possible will be super important.
I know I shouldn't put my 2 bobs worth in, but also I think another thing we should all be doing is talking to our industry associations. One thing that always fascinates me is the agriculture industry have so many different associations and they've all got different objectives, and I think that we should be, as if we're members of those associations, is going and talking to the leadership committee and sharing these ideas like the ABSF report, the good meat, what was that, David? Red meat, green facts, things like that, so that we can start getting them to all start singing from the same song sheet as well. Any more, Jeff?
Tim Burble, cattle producer from South Australia. My question's to David Foote, fellow South Australian. We're constantly told that our beef is the best beef in the world. We have a traceability system, which the producer has bought into and bore the cost of that. We've got great quality meat in so far as the NSA grading system, so producers are spending more money buying bulls to increase things like IMF, and soon it appears that we will be hit with another quality parameter, which will be some form of environmental sustainability parameters. And that's all good, and I think most producers are happy to buy into that and bear the cost and do the right thing. But I suppose, like most of us, this year we see the prices start coming down rapidly, and we're told that's because of what's happening in the world market, that beef's a commodity product. And so the frustration, I think, from most producers is that we're doing all these things, we're producing a premium product, we're bringing on more and more costs and more impost into the business, yet it seems that the main driver of the beef price is things like the 90 CL price in the US. So what will need to happen for Australian beef to move away from being a commodity product, where producers can and the meat exporters can start really getting a premium for all these fantastic things that we do?
Geez, Tim. The fact that we still are able to ship 1.7 million tonne of beef around the globe is an indication or warrants of the production systems that we have in place, and yes, have invested heavily in. It is the cost to service those markets to be there. We are up there in all, you call it the premium markets. Beef is not a commodity, it's a staple. And if you think about 34% of every animal that you produce ends up in a McDonald's or a Wendy's or a Burger King hamburger. So that will still be, whether you want to call it a commodity or not, it doesn't matter. We're in a time. It's ground beef, and it is the single largest market on the planet for beef. And let's not say that our systems over in the end will actually give us access to those over potentially our South Americans. Or if you want to be the world's largest beef producer, is India. Their beef doesn't go into McDonald's or Yum or Hungry Jack's simply because they don't have the systems in place to ensure safe, edible products. But you can't just claim a premium for everything that we do. We're doing it to maintain access and share a market. Our product sells for twice the price of Brazilian beef and Argentinian beef in our key North Asian markets. We sell for the same price as the US beef, which is mostly mid-fed or long-fed beef going to those markets, albeit ours isn't. So our everyday beef that we produce, that goes onto the shelves that Paul looks after and his competitors, is still selling at a higher price than others around the world. It is less affordable than others around the world. So we are getting the premium. Even at today's prices, which are clearly about 300 cents below where we were when we sat down here last year, it is still selling for that premium above other product. It's just our cost base has gone with us. So unless you come back and you pick up a premiumisation, which is either exclusivity, which won't happen in a global sense, because the hurt out there amongst every economy, community is exactly the same as we're facing here in Australia today. So Tim, there is no silver bullet apart from if we want the widest market access, which means the widest competition available for our product, we need to keep in front of our competitors. And our competitor isn't just Brazilian beef or Indian buffalo. Our competitors are Mexico, Canada, US and parts of Europe. So we've got to keep there just to stay in the game.
Excellent, David. That's a good way to answer the question. Excellent. Well, look, we've run out of time today. I'm guessing everyone's getting a bit thirsty and probably a little bit hungry. So I just want to thank our three guests tonight. I think we all got a lot out of that. I know I could ask each of you an hour-long lot of questions and still only scratch the surface. So I want to thank you all for the time. And I think you'll all be here for afterwards for anyone to bail them up in the corner and ask them a question, especially Paul. I'm sure he'd be willing and able to answer all questions you've got, wouldn't you, Paul? Absolutely. Excellent. And I'll hand over to Jeff now to wrap things up before we have dinner. Well, this was one of those podcasts where I really enjoyed reviewing the audio, and I got more out of it the second time I listened. If you're enjoying the podcast and want to show your support, a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify would be absolutely great. And also, if you'd share the wealth and wisdom and tell your friends and family about the Financial Bloke podcast. So that's it for this week, and I'll see you in 2 weeks' time.